Leaving the military can feel like losing the one place where people could read your face before you even said a word. When you come home, you go to work, you maybe sit with your family, and still feel miles away from the people who really understand what you're going through. The better path in your life could be learning how to stop carrying all of that baggage alone, how to find trusted people again, and how to build a life where service, family, work, and purpose can fit all together in the same room. Our guest today, Bryan Rigg, brings that conversation through World War II history, the Holocaust, Marine Corps culture, and the idea of primary groups, showing how connection shaped men in combat and why losing it after service can be really difficult to deal with. You're going to hear about why accountability, check-ins, older veterans, therapy, and meaningful books can help a veteran rebuild structure when the old unit is gone. But before we get into this episode, I want to take a moment to raise awareness for something that's deeply important to our community, the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation. This organization is working to build a permanent national memorial in Washington, D.C. to honor the service members, families, and civilians who are impacted by the global war on terrorism. This memorial will be both a tribute to those who served and a way to ensure that their sacrifices are recognized and remembered for generations to come. If you'd like to learn more or find out how you can support their mission, visit gwatmemorialfoundation.org. Now let's get into today's episode. Hey, Bryan, welcome to the show. Really glad to have you here.
Hey, Scott. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Before we jump into the episode here, could you maybe start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background, just for maybe the listeners who aren't familiar with you and who you are, just to kind of give a little background on all of that.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Scott. So I was born in Arlington, Texas, raised here, went off to Yale University, where I got a degree in German studies, English, and history. Got the Henry Fellowship, which is like a Rhodes Scholarship just for Harvard or Yale to go either to Oxford or Cambridge. And I decided to go to Cambridge, and I studied under Jonathan Steinberg there, and got a master's and a PhD in European history, religious history, and the Holocaust. Since then, I've written 6 books on World War II and the Holocaust. My most recent one is called Japan's Holocaust. And I've written 2 other books, one on ADHD and dyslexia, and one to come out on religion and how, unfortunately, Christianity throughout the centuries, especially during the Holocaust, supported the anti-Semitism that we saw instead of preventing it, which is a really sad commentary on the theological development of Christianity up to that date. I did a little stint in the Israeli army. I was a volunteer in the summer of 1998. And then I served in the Marine Corps from 99 to 2001 as an officer. It was an air contract. We got injured. So they stuck me in a think tank called the Warfighting Lab, which sounds much more prestigious than what it was. But it was a good place. I was under Major Bryan Goodmanson, and then later 4-star General John Allen, and they really took care of me. I was supposedly like the 13th guy on active duty in the Marine Corps to have a PhD. So I was kind of a weird unicorn, if you will. Once I got out of the Marine Corps, I was a professor for several years at SMU, an American military university. Did a couple of stints at my alma mater high school, Phillips Exeter Academy. And then in 2006, I said, I can't feed my family on the salaries that they're paying me as a teacher, especially at SMU. SMU does a very poor job of paying its teachers and professors, even though it's a very wealthy school. And I was like, if a wealthy school like this treats its professors like this is not going to bode well for me, giving my kids a good life and so on. So I went on Wall Street, eventually set up my own firm, Rigg Wealth Management. And now my main job during the day is taking care of people's stocks and bonds and their cash management and their life goals. But then on the side, I keep my foot in the academic world and continue to write books about World War II and Holocaust and try to honor our history. I just wrote a book called Flamethrower, which is like the Band of Brothers for the Marine Corps. It documents the last Medal of Honor recipient, Woody Williams' life in World War II with his unit, the Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines of the 3rd MARDIV, the 3rd Marine Corps Division of World War II that fought on Guam and then Iwo Jima. And I really did my best to kind of give back to the Marine Corps, because when I got injured, I wasn't able to go to flight school. And for about a year and a half, they really took care of me to try to help me with my injury, get me back on my feet. And as you know, the Marine Corps is like a religion. I mean, they really take care of each other. They're fervently passionate about their creeds. It's the only service that you become, you don't join and leave, and you always are a Marine. So that was kind of my biggest service, I think, to the Marine Corps, was doing a 5-year intensive study of this Marine Corps unit and going to 18 different archives in 5 different nations: Japan, China, America, Germany, and Guam, our territory. And so that's one way that I've kind of kept my foot in the door of continuing to do service, if you will,
Hmm.
continue doing academic research while during the day I crunch numbers and place trades for my clients. I'm a proud father of 4, soon to be 5 children. I have a second marriage and decided to give it a go again. If you've seen Bill Burr's movie, Old Dads, that's me. Now I got a 1.5-year-old little girl and a boy on the way. So I'm a very proud father. I have 3 very successful older children. Older daughter is an elementary school teacher in Brooklyn and an MMA Renaissance armor fighter. And
Okay.
she's a world champion in the lightweight division. And then I have a son who's in his last year at Vanderbilt. And then I have another son that just graduated high school and is going to go to University of Florida. And he was the captain of his 6A private school football team, and they won state this year. So I'm very proud of my kids as well.
Well, yeah, awesome. It seems like, a great way to keep your yourself included in the Marine Corps and the culture and everything by doing all that research, telling the stories from all the people who are who served before us and who have done so many great things that those stories need to be told. And I'm sure some of them have been told in one way or another, but always discovering new things and new angles and stuff like that, and figuring out ways to get those out to the masses so that people know the we were talking before we started recording here, know the sacrifices that were made for
And
our
this,
country.
yeah, amen, Scott. Thank you for bringing this up. And on this note, I want to bring out something that was quite telling that I was shocked about. I mean, so we just had Memorial Day weekend. We've often touted, never forget, always honor, and we do, as a nation, we do a very good job of doing that compared, especially a lot of other nations, and especially compared to a lot of other nations throughout time. But one thing that I was shocked by is when I was doing research on Iwo Jima, I went to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. And you would think that Iwo Jima, one of the biggest battles of World War II, it is the battle for the Marine Corps, like, if it's identification, the flag raising on Mount Suribachi and so on. I was shocked that when I asked for several boxes of the Fleet Marine Force documents, which was over at the Amphibious Corps, that was the third corps that, was focusing on this operation. When I was looking at the 3rd Mardiv Division records and then the battalion and regimental records, quite often I would get these boxes in the National Archives and they had folders inside that were still stapled. They had not been opened since World War II.
Oh
And
wow.
I'm thinking to myself, here I am in a huge room. There's many people doing research there. I'm probably the only one doing research of that particular day on World War II. But over this battle that everybody knows about, I was opening up files nobody had looked at in 70 years. And quite often, what was even more fascinating, speaking of Memorial Day, so I was documenting this unit that was a Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines. And when I got a lot of their names, I went to the St. Louis National Archives where our personnel files are. And there was many guys in the chain of command that were lieutenant colonels, even a few generals, that when I got their files, they hadn't been opened since the 40s or 50s, since the guy left the service.
Wow.
And these guys were in charge of sometimes 20,000 men. And I'm thinking to myself, good Lord, we have this thing never forget, but almost, I would say, probably 70% of all the guys that I document in my book, Flamethrower, nobody knew about until I wrote about them. I'm sure their families knew they served in the Marine Corps. They have probably the flag from when they were buried. They knew they fought on this island. But as far as who they were, what they did, what they saw, getting their letters, their fit reps, and so on, I was the first one to do this. And I just was thinking, man, if I, looking at a battle that's well known, am finding this out, how much is not known about some lesser battles? Like I looked at Guam, and most of the documents I looked at had never seen the light of day.
Mm-hmm.
Many people don't even know that Guam was our territory. Japan had occupied it and had killed 10% of the population during World War II in concentration camps sometimes on American soil.
Yeah.
So this excites me that I still am able to do these type of things, serve my nation that way with my brain and documenting history, and how important it is to remember Memorial Day weekend that we had, but that how much is still out there that we don't know, especially about these men. I mean, I had several family members get in touch with me that once I documented what they actually had done on the islands, it brought tears to their eyes, gave them a sense of pride. Now they know not only was he on this island, but this is what he did. Here are the guys he lost. This is where he was. And that's very important to remember.
Yeah, and that's piecing it together too, from not just that one individual, but then the other folks who were in that same unit who were serving with them, and a lot of them were probably friends or at least knew each other and things like that. I mean, anyone who's served in any sort of unit in any capacity, that there's other folks there that you're going to remember probably till the day you die. And as you're serving alongside those folks, unfortunately in combat sometimes they don't make it home, and what happens to these people, and oftentimes those stories, when service members come home, they don't necessarily want to talk about those things, so the family members don't always know about those types of things that happened, and it's probably very eye-opening when someone does learn of those things going forward, right?
Yep.
And so I kind of want to change gears just a little bit here, and I want to talk. I'm still talking about some of the work that you've done, but there's a concept of primary groups, I believe, that you've done some work on as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about primary groups and what they are, and kind of how that might fit into the work that you do?
Sure. Now, in particular, where you read about this the most or find out, especially in the German language, is what the Wehrmacht did in World War II in the German army. Is that what you're referencing to?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So, what made the German military so effective, besides Germans being very law abiding, very disciplined, very team oriented people, especially back then, is that when they recruited guys into units, when they had the universal draft reinstated in 1935, is that they recruited from that region. So you were going off to training quite often in your actual platoon and company with guys that you had gone to elementary school with, junior high with, and high school. You had dated each other's girlfriends. Many of them were, cousins, et cetera, et cetera. There was a very tight family unit dynamic already when they went in to train. So then you bring the training and then the test by fire and in blood, in combat. These units became very tight with each other because of all the social webbing that these guys had going into the military and then after their training and experience in war. So the primary group was very critical to German success in the early years when they weren't taking a lot of casualties. After probably the first and a half to first 2 years of the 4-year war in Russia, these primary groups were largely decimated and gone. Germany was still a very effective fighting force. They still were recruiting from the regions, but they were trying to fill the ranks so quickly. Instead of having the disciplined approach of doing, proper training and so on, when they were trying to fill the ranks in 43 and 44 and fast tracking training and so on, the primary groups went away and they were not as effective. But even with that being said, if you study the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, where America really got its nose bloodied in late 44, that is a testament to how effective the German military training still was, and how they taught how to work together as a unit. As Napoleon said, you usually had to have a 1 to 3 superiority on the attack to take over the position. Well, in many cases, it was like 1 to 10 ratio to be able to take over these German positions. We'd have 10 guys to take out one German. And we saw this also in Italy as we were moving up. We never took over all of Italy.
Mhm.
The Germans, their defensive techniques, especially under General Heinrici, was truly remarkable that this little nation was able to do what it did with its population and then with its military culture and then the primary groups. Kind of reminds me of a funny story. And I'm sure I probably don't have all the facts right, but the general gist of it is true. So de Gaulle was doing a tour of Russia in 43, and Khrushchev was showing him about the remnant of the battlefield of Stalingrad. And de Gaulle was looking at just the massive destruction all around him. And he's like, what a remarkable people. And Khrushchev said, yes, we Russians, we fought very hard. We lost 1 million people at this battle. We never gave up. And de Gaulle says, no, I'm not talking about the Russians. I'm talking about the Germans, that they come 1,500 miles here with 1 million men to fight a battle here, and were able to sustain it for several months, and almost went, what a remarkable people. Khrushchev didn't like that too much, but there's some truth to it, that the Germans did so much more with so much less in many respects than what other nations did. And part of the reason why their success was so great early on, besides the war of movement, the Bewegungskrieg, Blitzkrieg, was those primary groups.
Yeah, and I can think back to my time in the Army. Other folks who have served probably can relate to this as well. When you're put together in a unit, it's not necessarily from the same local region. You're not necessarily going to be going to the same unit with your high school buddy, like you're describing here. You get people from all over the country, and it's just a big mix of people, different cultures and races and religions, and everything's just kind of mixed together. But I know from my experience, I would fight just as hard for the guy next to me who I didn't know growing up. I maybe only met a few months ago, before we deployed, and I would fight just as hard for him as I would somebody who I knew, for the longest time, because of that brotherhood that we generated, and it was a very important thing. But I can only imagine those folks who did grow up with these people. They'd known them since they were little kids playing at school or wherever in their neighborhoods, and like obviously you don't want to come home and feel like a failure that your friend who you grew up with didn't make it home either. So you're going to fight even harder perhaps for those people. I can see how that would be very advantageous in a combat situation. Now these primary groups, I'm wondering, like, I can see the benefit during combat. I'm wondering how they affected the soldiers after the war, after coming back home to those same regions where maybe not everybody came home, and what happened, or was there some way that the folks that they served with are who did make it home, they're all in that area, maybe they helped each other dealing with life after combat. A lot of different ways that can go, I can see. But in your experience from kind of research that you've done, what have you seen as far as like the post-war situation with those?
Well, I hope I got the name right. We had that problem with the 5 Solomon brothers in the Navy, and the ship went down, and all of them, well, went down with it. And after that, we did a very good job of making sure brothers were split off so they weren't in the same unit. Now, in the Civil War, we had people usually from the same area recruited in the Union, and I'm sure the Confederacy was like this to some degree. My great great grandfather, David L. Davidson, he fought at Vicksburg, and when you look at his uh, company that's in the plaque and the big Pantheon Memorial for the Illinois soldiers, he's with the 116th Illinois. You look at his company, out of like 50 names, 7 were Davidsons. all from the same area. So, and one of them was his brother, we know, and he died later on. Many of them cousins and so on. So, you probably had the same dynamic that we're talking about the Germans with the Union units, at least, because a lot of them went from their regions. The one thing that you learned about from the Civil War when they came from, one area, in World War One, they were doing this. Also in England, they're doing this, and in Germany as well, is that if you were in a particularly tough situation, a tough battle, and your unit got wiped out, you just destroyed a town. You just destroyed a village. You
Yeah.
know,
Right.
all those men are gone. The mothers are devastated. Wives are widows, and so on. So a lot of these guys, the Germans, they lost 7 million people during World War II. About half of them were the soldiers. So that put that in context, 3.5 million men died in uniform. They had like 18 million men go through the ranks, so it's still a minority, but it's still dramatic when you look at America had 16 million in uniform, and we only quote unquote lost 400,000.
Right.
But many American families have their story of guys they've lost and so on. So getting back to how these men recovered, Germany is going to be different than probably America or the British or the Union example that I'm giving, because in the British and American examples, they came back to a just victory.
Hmm.
Even if their town was devastated, they could keep their heads high and say, we fought, to preserve the Union, do away with slavery. I had three great grandfathers who fought for the Union. And I'm sure these are the topics that they had, even though my great great grandfather lost a brother and some cousins and so on. England as well. Hey, we preserved the peace. We won the Great War. We can go in parades to keep our heads high. The Germans come back, and you got the Nuremberg trials, which, we just had this movie Nuremberg with Russell Crowe showing about Goering and that dramatic event in history of how you create international law to prosecute evil actors during war and violations against humanity, but also how the people thought at this time period and what they actually did. We actually, one of the best documented wars ever, if you will, because these trials really collected a lot of the data as they were doing their due diligence, and also the trial in Tokyo. So, getting to your very interesting question about the Germans, it's truly remarkable that they come back, they've been devastated. Their towns have been, there's not one brick on top of the other in Berlin, for example, and many of the other cities. They're shamed, because they fought for Hitler.
Hmm.
All the stuff coming out about from the Nuremberg trials shows about their atrocities against the Jews and other, quote unquote, what they called inferior people, Untermenschen. So they didn't have parades. They weren't able to put out flags. If they had miniature reunions, which they did, they had to keep it very quiet. So these guys really suffered in silence with, justifying serving their nation because they were drafted and they were proud Germans, but then realizing what the end goal was going to be ultimately, what they were doing to support. So these guys were extremely conflicted. And quite often when I interviewed, as you know from my bio, I interviewed 430 men of Jewish descent who served in the Nazi military. It's 800 hours of video material that I've digitalized, and the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. has taken on this collection. It's called the Bryan Rigg collection. It's the second largest oral history collection in their possession. And when I interviewed these guys and talked to them, a lot of times in the 90s when I was doing the interviews, this is the first time they were asked a lot of questions because they just repressed it. And they took a lot of that anger and that frustration and the discipline that they learned in the military, and they really did amazing things in their societies. As many people will know, it's called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic wonder of the 60s and 70s, when all of a sudden you had this explosion of German industry on the scene, and they're getting their pride back with Mercedes and BMW and so on, and Opel. And you see kind of the same phenomenon in Japan. They also, at this time period, with Suzuki and Yamaha and so on, Nissan, just explode. And that's kind of how they took all that frustration that, okay, I can't talk about what I did in the war. This was embarrassing. how do we get our pride back? And they shifted all that energy and patriotism, if you will, into doing things that were very productive and that could allow them to keep their head high. So they had to repress a lot of things. Whereas, you and I get together, we have a beer. If we know we put on the uniform, we're able to talk to each other fairly honestly and candidly, and we're very proud. We don't care if people overhear our conversations. Germans didn't have that luxury after World War II, even though many of them were very simple, good, hardworking men who only after the fact that they realized, oh my God, this was a lot more evil than I ever thought.
Right, right. And that sometimes, like when you're in the thick of it, you don't see the whole picture. You just see, okay, here are my orders. I'm supposed to go and we're going to go fight over here. And those are our enemy. That's what we're being told. And so we're going to go fight those people. And then only after the fact, like you said, through the trials and through other reports and things like that, you start to realize, oh, what was I actually a part of? And that could have a devastating impact on somebody. But I would imagine being a part of that primary group where several people from that same area are coming back and they all were involved in that, at least there's somebody there who understands you and can understand what you've been through, because they went through the same exact thing, and they probably are having the same conflicted feelings that you're having, and at least there's someone there that you can kind of go chat with at least, and not feel like you're a total monster for bringing up some of these things to someone who didn't experience it, right?
And I think that's something that's you hit on something that's kind of interesting. These primary groups, so they come back to their towns, and many of them return back to where they came from.
Yeah.
So when they talk to these guys, they're forced to have interactions with them because they went to school with each other. Those are their business contacts. A lot of times, their family relationships. So they have the contact with these guys, and there's probably more opportunity to have conversations to do the healing. That's the problem, as in our military, is that you're right. We do a very good job during our training to bring a whole bunch of different guys from different walks of life, and within 10 weeks, we're willing to die for them. And when we're out there fighting, we're not asking, hey, is the guy on my right black or white, gay or heterosexual? It's like, he's my brother in arms. He's been trained. We've gone through this. I know I can trust him.
Right.
And that's a beautiful thing about the military. I wish, I think, we have so many problems with race relations in America right now. I think we had universal service, which I saw in Israel. I mean, you have blacks and whites, Sephardic, Ashkenazi. You have Druze, which are Muslims, and Jews that are Jewish. And they all come together, and within 10 weeks, they're willing to die for each other. And they're in a unit with each other quite often until they're in their 40s. Because everybody's in the reserves. And that's a beautiful thing I saw there. And I have a brother-in-law who's Finnish, and I know from Finland's experience, they do the same thing. And they have horrible Russia on the doorstep. So, getting back to our experience, we have this wonderful brotherhood that we all have when we're in the service. But then when we come back, we're spread to the four corners of the earth, in America. And we don't have as many opportunities to come together and share experiences. And that's really true healing. I think one aspect of the benefit of World War II was that when the war was over, you were stuck with your guys for several months in country and then on ship coming back. And a lot of healing happened because you were able to talk about what happened.
Yeah.
We don't have that. And Germany, I think, after World War II, because of the primary units, if there was enough of them left afterwards, they had that unit cohesion still in their social dynamics. As you could go next door and talk to your gunner. You could go next door and talk to the men that were under your command, or your commanding officer if you needed advice because you were fed up with your wife, or you wanted to change a job, or you were having nightmares. And we do a horrible job of taking care of our veterans after the fact, of keeping them together for a few more months or forcing a reunion on them like every year, because, as you know, your brothers in arms, you can't lie to.
Yeah, right.
You can't fake being happy. Whereas in society, if people don't know about the military, you're not going to give them the time of day, but you may be really suffering. And just that little glance in the eyes that a brother and comrade would be able to recognize. People in regular life are not going to. So I think that's another benefit of the German primary group, probably, if you were to do a sociological study on it, is that it really enabled a good social dynamic for these guys to get a lot of stuff off their chest. And that probably part and parcel was one reason why they were so successful in being incredible leaders in the economy in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that, put Germany, which is half the size of Texas, on the map as a world economic power.
Right. And I think that was one thing I wanted to bring up is this just the size of some other countries, Germany being the one that we just happen to be talking about here, being, just land area half the size of Texas. And when you look at the size of the United States, when you have people from all over the country coming together, serving together, you have people from Alaska and Florida and Maine and California and all over the Midwest and everywhere else that you could think of, all coming together and serving together, and you shuffle that deck of cards basically, and it's just a mix of people from everywhere. And then afterwards they go scatter back to where they came from. And it's going to be a lot harder just geographically to get people to come back together and physically be together. I mean, I know nowadays, you and I are not we're not even in the same state, but we're able to talk as if we're sitting together in the same room because of technology. Way back when they didn't have that kind of technology, even sometimes a phone call would be difficult to do the way we're doing a, call like this right now. And so the benefit for them is that they were close regardless of where in the country they ended up. They were going to be relatively close, and relative to the United States. For us, it's a lot more difficult, but it's not impossible either. Especially nowadays with the technology, there are ways that you can get back in touch with people, and you can talk with them. And I think part of the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because I think so often we come back from combat or we leave the service and we just kind of stick to ourselves and we isolate away from anybody that had anything to do with the military or anything like that, and we feel like we're all alone. Well, that's in part our own doing. We kind of stick ourselves in a corner, shut the lights off, lock the door, and we don't want to talk to anyone or do anything with anyone. And well, okay, then you're going to go out and complain that you don't have anybody who understands you. Well, there's a lot of people who might understand you. You're just not getting in touch with those people. And I know it's a two-way street, obviously. The other people can reach out and get in touch with you too. But sometimes you got to take the initiative and be that person to say, hey, you know what, maybe I'm going to organize this, reunion. I'm going to get our guys back together, and maybe not everyone can make it, but let's try to get everybody that we can and get them together and have that kind of process that you're talking about, that healing process where we can all get together, we can all share stories, we can all talk and things like that. Just last summer, I went back to visit with some of the guys that I served with. It wasn't everybody that I served with. It was but a handful of guys were there, and we got to share stories and everything like that. And it was good to catch up. It was almost 15 years later that we had been in Afghanistan, and being able to chat with them at that point was kind of cool to do. And we don't do that every year. We don't, it's been a while since I had seen some of these guys, but being able to do that was good. It was good for me, good for a lot of them. And I think, enough people just don't either have that opportunity or create that opportunity for themselves to go out and do that. And I think they maybe discount the impact that it could have, right?
Yeah, yeah. And on the note, there's an interesting book I recommend anybody to read, but especially our brother and sister veterans who are watching this. It's from a friend of mine. He went to the same prep school that I did, Phillips Exeter Academy, which was just a phenomenal. When I was there, it's kind of fallen off academically. What it once was, it's kind of very ideologically really on the left instead of giving a balanced picture, which is what education should be. It should be both talking about Republicans and Democrats and so on in the same voice. But that's neither here nor there. What I'm getting at, we went to a very good school. We were very proud of our experience. He was there in the 60s. I was there in the 90s. And he's one of the foremost experts on ADHD and dyslexia. His name is Dr. Ned Hallowell out of Harvard. And he's proofread my work, given me a lot of feedback. But he wrote a phenomenal book called Connect. Mm-hmm. And the whole premise of the book is saying people who live the healthiest lives are the ones who have kind of built in mechanisms in their lives that force them to connect. And he says it's kind of counterintuitive, you think, because if we talk about connection, which you and I are talking about right now, the importance, especially people who have gone through fire and sacrifice, they need to stay connected to their units to stay mentally healthy.
Yeah.
But in life in general, we need to stay connected. But what Ned Hallowell found out, which is very interesting, is that people actually kind of build in walls to prevent them from getting to those places of connection.
Hmm.
But if they force themselves to break through those walls and connect, they feel so much better for having done so.
Sure.
So what this book basically shows is that people need to force accountability structures, if you will, like we had in the military, that force them to connect. And whether that's like showing up at the bar once a week, having your trainer that you paid for, that you have to go to the gym, accountability sectors that force you to connect with people that matter in
Hmm.
your life, family members, birthdays, these type of events, weddings are very, very important. But reunions, check-in times, if you know that some of your buddies are struggling, you say, okay, hey, let's just get on the calendar. 3 months, we're meeting via Zoom. Like, now we don't have the excuse saying, well, it's just too far away. I'm in Alaska and you're in Florida.
Right.
That doesn't work anymore. So that's one thing that this book is brilliant about, is just showing you how you got to fake yourself out sometimes to set up a standard operating procedure in life that forces you to connect.
Yeah, and it's a piece of that discipline that we all had in the military, where there were certain things that you had to do, a certain way that you had to do them, and certain times that had to be done, and all these things that were set up for you. There was criteria, there were checklists, there were things that needed to be done in very specific ways, and so it's like, okay, well, that's the job. I'm going to just go ahead and do that. Well,
Yep.
now that we're out of the military and we don't have, you know, big military oversight hanging over us, telling us what to do, where to be, what to be wearing, when to go to sleep, when to get up, when to eat, and all that kind of stuff. Well, we have to build that in ourselves, and we have to have that discipline to stick with it and realize when things are not working. I think is also important, because I know for myself, after getting back from Afghanistan, I kind of was one of those people who didn't want to do anything. I didn't want to go talk to anybody. I just want to be alone, and I wanted to stay away. And after a little while, I realized, hey, that's not working. I'm turning into a terrible version of myself, and this is not who I want to be for for my wife, for my kids, for anybody really. I just
Yep.
wanted to be a different version of myself, and I said, well, if what I'm doing isn't working, continuing to do the same thing isn't going to help anything. So
Right.
I need to make some sort of changes. And so that was step one, is just recognizing, hey, this isn't going to work. I got to do something else. Step two is figuring out what is that something else. And sometimes it's not as obvious to people what they need to do. Sometimes it, even things like therapy and going and talking in confidence to somebody is terrifying to some people, but sometimes that might be what you need. And
Especially we men in America,
yeah.
been to the military, talking to a shrink is, weak.
Right.
And in many respects, I think the best shrinks, if you will, are our brother and comrades. But there is, for good therapists, which they're a small minority, but for good therapists, I think they can help some people really work through some serious issues. Before my second marriage, I did an awful lot of therapy
Hmm.
because I didn't want to go through the same debacle that I had with my first divorce that I got blindsided by.
Sure.
So that kind of turned me around with the therapist that I had. So I think, yeah, that's another thing that we, especially men, need to demystify, that, hey, if you're not getting the help from your comrades or your friends, or you're not getting help, period, here, accountability, paying somebody, like paying a trainer, will maybe force you to always show up
Right.
and
Right.
get the help you need so you can go back and be a better husband and be a better father and be a better coworker and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's actually a while back, we were in our family was kind of involved in doing some selling tickets to different events, and it wasn't like we were trying to make a ton of money to any of these events, but we would have given the tickets away for free. But what we noticed was we had limited capacity for how many people that we could allow into these things, and if we gave the tickets away for free, of course anyone's going to just take the tickets. But then only about a third of the people would actually show up.
Wow.
So what we would do is we would say, okay, well, the tickets are going to be $1 or $5 or something small enough that it's not going to be breaking the bank for most people, but also they're committed now. They spent money. They thought to themselves, am I actually going to go? If not, well, I'm not going to buy the ticket. If I am going to go, well, then okay, yeah, I'll buy the ticket. And the attendance rate shot up to almost full capacity. Obviously, there's going to be some issues every now and again, but that small, even a small financial investment will get people to really commit to it and think to themselves, like, how much do I actually want to participate in this? And if I don't want to participate it, well, I'm not going to spend the money on a therapist or what other training you might be dealing with. But
Yeah, there's no pun intended when you say they have buy-in.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's definitely buy-in, and they're doing it. It's their own choice to do it too. And so if they're doing it, they're now saying to themselves, okay, I'm committing to this resource, whatever it happens to be. And so that's, I think, important as well, especially if you don't have that group of people who you can talk to, even on a Zoom call or a phone call or whatever. There are ways that you can still get that connection and get the help that you might need through a therapist or through some other avenue that might be out there. So this is all like just it's interesting how the different cultures, the German people that we were talking about before, and Japanese people had their way of dealing with things, and like all around the world there's different ways of dealing with things. But I think it all kind of boils down to that connection piece, regardless of what the culture was or what the war was, the time period or anything like that. It's really connecting with people who can understand what you went through and be able to talk with people. And if you don't have that, it's going to be a lot harder going through it on your own, I think, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely great points that have been brought up here. I think a lot to be learned from history. There's that saying that history repeats itself, and if you let it anyways. And
Well, if you don't learn it, it definitely will repeat itself.
sure.
And I like what Mark Twain said. He says, history may not repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, and that actually makes a ton of sense too, because we our human nature is going to force us into those same patterns and end up doing a lot of the same stuff, unless we learn something from it. And I think that's true not only in world history or U.S. history or whatever, looking back in time at historical events and saying, okay, what can we learn from those things, but also in ourselves, in our own personal histories. What mistakes have I made in the past, and how can I avoid making those mistakes again in the future? And what can I learn from those lessons that I'm taking away from that mistake that I made, or that thing that happened? Any of those things are equally as important to carry forward with you going down the line, because obviously you make a mistake once, you don't want to make it again. So let's learn from those things, and I think it's definitely something that you can learn from, you can overcome, but again, you have to be willing to learn from it and be open and receptive to those types of things. So when you're taking a look at yourself and saying, hey, what have I screwed up in my life, and what can I do better? Like, you have to be open to that type of criticism and that self-reflection and all that. So and it's not a negative thing either. It's not, it's how we learn, it's how we grow. It's it's as a little kid, when you're learning how to ride a bike and you fall off and you scrape your knee, it's like, well, I don't want to do that again. So what did I do wrong as I was riding that bike so I don't end up having to do that again?
Yeah, it's like having I'm sure you've heard of the ODA loop.
Yes.
You
Yeah,
know,
absolutely.
most military guys have, but how you observe something and you learn from it, and then you build in mechanisms that you don't do the same thing again. And it kind of reminds me of a proverb. It says, as a dog returneth to his vomit, so does a fool returneth to his folly.
Yeah.
So if you don't build in mechanisms, and quite often with our brothers in arms and sisters in arms, after action reports when you get together. Those are brutal.
Yeah.
You did this wrong. You did this right. You could have got somebody killed. You did get somebody killed. It wasn't intent, but this, and we have a system in place if it wasn't gross negligence, obviously,
Hmm.
to help those guys. Especially, my brother was a Harrier pilot, and he said they were brutal with each other a lot of times after missions, because there is really a zero defect
Yeah.
environment. And I think if we could build that type of mechanism into our lives after the service, because I think all of us will realize having that part of our service made us better,
Yeah.
made us more professional, and to be open to that constructive criticism. Because normally your brother in arms are not doing this to make you feel bad.
Sure.
They're trying to do this to make sure you're more effective in combat later on, and then hopefully in real life we can do that. But especially males, we're big egos with small legs, and so how you build that into the male psyche to be open to that criticism, especially a guy who's been in the service that comes back to the civilian realm and thinks, in many cases, rightly so, that he's surrounded by idiots. Because they're complaining about stupid stuff. They're not organized. They're not team oriented, and to get a good feedback loop from competent people around you sometimes is very hard to get. That's another reason to stay in touch with your buddies that you went through the military with, because they're a cut above the rest of society just from their experience.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I think from this conversation so far, a lot of good takeaways of having that community, having that connection, having even manufacturing it yourself, finding those people if you're not around the area where all the people that you served with are. I mean, there are places like American Legions and VFWs, and you can find your community somewhere.
Marine Corps League.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
there's so many things. Yeah.
So many things out there that you can go to and find the people who can understand you. Maybe they didn't serve with you, they didn't know exactly what you went through because they weren't there, but they can fill in the blanks, and they can understand. Right.
And I want to offer two observations here. What you're talking about with how to build a community. If somebody's listening to this and he's like, I don't have a community, I don't have many guys that I can go talk to in society, I'd ask them to do the following: go to some of the local retirement centers in your hometown and ask the director, hey, who would be 3 veterans that I should talk to that are here? And especially 3 veterans that don't get a lot of visits. And go talk to those Korean and Vietnam veterans. And God forbid, I mean, if there's a couple of World War II, I mean,
Sure.
they have to be over 100. And connect with them. As an older brother, younger brother type of dynamic, talk to them. If you don't have that connection with some veterans, make the connections and add something to somebody's life at the very end of his life. Give him some value, but also hear some of his wisdom.
Yeah.
Another thing that you're bringing up that reminds me of something to encourage our brother and sister veterans who maybe are struggling. A lot of times people say, what's the point of it all? Especially after they come out of bad situations, especially I'm sure what you saw in Afghanistan. It was just a mess, and the society there was just so bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
So, questioning what was I fighting for? Why did my brother die? Et cetera, et cetera. One book that's helped a lot of people and helped me is called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He survived Auschwitz. And he came up with a terminology called logotherapy. And this has helped me when I've been in bad situations in my life and I'm kind of struggling and floundering away. It starts to give me direction. He quotes Nietzsche, but he says basically if you can answer the why of why you should do something, we're talking now why to connect, why to work with your getting rid of your demons, why should you continue on developing the SOPs that helped you in the military and life and so on. If you can answer that why, you can deal with any how. Mm-hmm. And what Viktor Frankl, who I actually had the blessing of interviewing back in the 1990s in Vienna, what he found was fascinating. He was in Auschwitz, and some of the healthiest, strongest guys that would show up at the camp, they were the ones that died the quickest. And some of the guys that were middle-aged, overweight and whatnot, they were, for lack of a better term, thriving after a few months. And he's like, what's going on here? The very people that you would pick to survive this nightmare when they were placed in the work center, because Auschwitz was by and large a death camp. Um, he's like, the very people that you think would survive are not, and the ones you don't think were going to survive are thriving. And when he interviewed them, he found they had a desire to get revenge. They had a desire to write a book. They had a desire to see their family. They had something that gave them the why. And then they could deal with any how of figuring it out. And this is a dramatic example of people finding the why and then ending up learning how to survive. But a lot of times, I mean, we veterans, we know we have a much higher rate of suicide, which is counterintuitive. This is not how we're trained. This is not what we do to our units. This is not what we do to our family. So having that why out there and answering that and holding each other accountable, why you should do this, will help people do the next right thing. And then do the next right thing, and then do the next right thing. And I think just taking those steps at a time, kind of like mission focus. And if the mission is just simple, I'm going to have a good day today, I'm going to be productive, I'm going to love my wife, I'm going to read books to my kids, and I'm going to call one comrade and see how he's doing. And just 5 minutes. Hey, John, I've been thinking of you, love you. If you need me, I'm here.
Yeah, and coming up with that why could be, a night and day difference for some folks. And so I'm going to include a link to that book in the show notes as well.
Hey, thanks.
I think that's
Viktor Frankl. It's got an interesting last name. It's Frankl.
Yeah.
Viktor Frankl. Man's Search for Meaning, and it's a quick read. Most people can sit down within probably 4 or 5 hours and have it read. And like I said, more people in my life that I've given that to, has it made a difference.
Sure.
And then getting to the primary group, for people who are interested in the German Army, one of the best memoirs of World War II, besides E.B. Sledge with The Old Breed, that I think is a great memoir, a Marine Corps guy that was at Peleliu and then Okinawa, is called The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sayer, Sajer. And besides being a powerful book about showing you what the German soldier went through in World War II, it's also a very powerful book like Viktor Frankl, and hopefully helping people realize, you know what, it could be a lot worse. And this is how you get through things.
Yeah. And I think oftentimes we forget that, that it can be a lot worse. Not that that's always necessarily the most uplifting way of looking at it, but realizing that, hey, you know what, there is a silver lining here. There's something good that you can take away from even a terrible situation, that at least fill in the blank, whatever that thing is, whatever that thing is that makes it a little bit more of a positive spin, can completely change your whole mindset on that whole situation. So those types of things I think are real important as well.
Amen, Scott. Amen. Preach on.
Well, Bryan, before we wrap up, anything else that you want to add, or any resources or anything that you want to share with the audience, the listeners, that to send them your way to help them find more information about your works and that type of stuff?
Well, hey, thanks so much. I'm working on a new website. I do have a website, which is my name, bryanmarkrigg.com. It has all my books. Amazon, you can find all my books. Those guys out there who have veteran meetings and they like to bring in speakers, I love speaking about World War II and the Holocaust. One other book, if people are interested in collecting books like we just talked about, like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, that helps give you perspective. One of the best works, and it got the Nobel Prize for Literature, by the way, one of the best works on the Holocaust to give you a feel for what that was like is Elie Wiesel, Wiesel, his book called Night. And that it's a very quick read, beautiful English, but also gives you perspective. Now, like you said, you can only go so far with people saying, hey, it could be a lot worse when they're in a dark place.
Sure.
And so there's a fine balance. I mean, my first wife, sometimes she would caveat, because I'm a Holocaust World War II historian, when she was complaining about something, she said, now, sweetheart, I know I'm not on a train to Auschwitz, but hear me out, please clean the dishes. There's no house elves, and it's pissing me off. So, there is some benefit of having perspective,
Yep.
meeting the person where he or she is at, realizing that maybe you can't understand why they're in such a dark place. Hey, you have a loving wife, you have kids, snap out of it. That's easier said than done. Or hey, you're not on a train to Auschwitz, snap out of it. But helping talk that person through what he's going through. And especially if he's a person who's seen combat and lost buddies and whatnot, which is quite often a lot of the times the guys who are in a dark place have, giving them perspective while talking about why they have the pain they do, the guilt they have, that they should have died or they should have done something differently, and so on. Well, then hopefully at the end, if you can get him or her to come to that conclusion, you know what? It could have been worse. I'm not on a train to Auschwitz. You're not telling them that, but then them realizing, then you're giving them a lifeline that they can use themselves.
Right.
And I think, I'm no psychologist, but from my experience talking with veterans, I talked to a lot of these German veterans that I can't tell you how often after I talked to them, that family members got in touch with me and said, I never knew this about him before. Now he's talking more to me. Now I realize why he was a kind of crappy dad when it came to emotions and so on. But it gave more understanding. So I think, when you ask me the wonderful question, what else would I leave the audience with? I think, those three books are really powerful. If you're trying to use World War II experiences to help you live a life today, because the enduring legacy of human suffering and human pain is universal throughout time. We really have it good, even we in America right now, veterans, and now you were in combat, I was not, but compared to what a lot of guys had to go through in combat in the past, we have it so much better. We have the medical care. We're only in country for 6 months or a year. I mean, these Germans sometimes were in protracted warfare for 6 years.
Yeah.
That also should give you a perspective, that we have so much more to be thankful for than to be bitter about. And I think these books that I just mentioned helps me come to that conclusion, especially when I get all wrapped up in my own navel and get upset about my own fate and where I'm at in life and so on.
Yeah, and I think an important thing that you mentioned there is helping people come to the conclusions on their own, as opposed to telling them what the conclusion should be. Because when you come to that conclusion on your own, it'll stick a little bit better than it will if someone's just telling you, hey, this is the answer, this is how it. Because your brain is working through the process, it's working that problem and getting it to a point where you're understanding it and not just coming from somebody else's understanding, and it'll help you tremendously that way. So yeah, as opposed to just telling people, hey, suck it up and deal with it and you'll be fine, and whatever, just smile and you'll be fine, all of a sudden, right? But
yeah, and on that note, excuse me for interrupting,
no
Scott,
problem.
but I think on the note, it's really important for people who are, it's starting to click in their brains that they're helping others, or they want to help their comrades. Like what you're saying, don't issue declaratory statements. Ask them open-ended questions.
Right.
What do you think about that? What has that told you? Or why did you say that? And then be open to the questions. And you may be thinking, suck it up. This is not nearly as bad as what we went through, and I was there. What's wrong with you?
That's right.
That's not a good open-ended question. Because you're basically saying, snap out of it.
Yep.
That's not a good way to do it. So I think, especially with these German veterans, when I had the open-ended questions, boy, it was amazing of what they went through in the cathartic process they went, because sharing pain is disseminating pain, which is very interesting concept.
Yeah.
You share your pain with somebody who you trust and you love. You're not being told to shut up and do away with the pain or stop feeling the pain. Suck it up, grow a pair. Type of mentality.
Yeah.
I think that's very important for people to know. It's just like, okay, let them, with open questions, share that pain, and that's also part of the healing process that we can do for each other as veterans.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Bryan, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insights, your experiences, everything that you've done research on and all that. It's definitely been, I think, a great conversation, and hopefully we'll be helpful to some folks out there who just maybe needed some of that perspective in their lives. So thank you again for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Hey, Scott, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet.